Frames of Reference.
3 films, 2 cinephiles, 1 podcast.
Cinema is my secret passion.
It's a foreign movie. A film is what it is.
But art films make people feel funny.
This film was a personal vision, not a marketing machine.
We're getting too many mainstream movies.
Episode 9, Sciammarama. Hello, I'm Colin Mahaney.
And I'm Sarah Page.
So we have a guest this week. Welcome, Adriana Gober. You want to just give a little bit of your of who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for very graciously inviting me to be a guest on your podcast. I am a film programmer. I work in film exhibition and distribution, and I really like queer cinema. So I imagine that has to do with why I got invited to be a guest for this specific episode.
I mean, you've also been a longtime champion of Céline Sciamma's work.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so we work together, even though I don't think we've ever had a work-related conversation together.
We should say, we both do work for Vinegar Syndrome.
Yeah. We've had a long history of talking about film, and this should be a really good discussion. This week we're talking about, as I mentioned, the works of Céline Sciamma, who is one of the leading French feminist filmmakers of the current era, I'd say. Honestly, one of the leading French filmmakers of the current era in my book.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So this week, we're going to be talking about 3 films. We're going to be talking about 2 films that are considered to be part of Sciamma's girlhood trilogy. That is Water Lilies and Tomboy. The 3rd film of that trilogy is called Girlhood, which we will not be discussing this week. And then we're going to talk about her masterpiece, Portrait of a Lady on Fire.
Which is probably the film that most people listening will be most familiar with.
Absolutely.
It was her breakout into the mainstream.
Yeah, I feel like Tomboy was on a lot of people's radars.
In overseas, anyway, people in France, she was better
huge.
known than she was internationally, for sure.
This was a massive film. A lot of people also saw Petite Maman, which came out 2 years ago. But we should probably just kick off our discussion with Water Lilies.
Her debut feature.
So this came out in 2007. It was a truly independent film that is kind of hard to find today. It's available on Blu-ray in Korea in an out-of-print box set. Or if you can get by without having English subtitles, there is a German release from Alamode. That's it. There is an out-of-print DVD from Kino Lorber, and it is streaming on Criterion, which is really the way most people are going to be able to watch it. That's how we all watched it.
It really badly needs a new Blu-ray release.
Oh, gosh. It's shocking that no one has stepped up to the plate to give this a release. But it was a fairly successful film at the time. It won the Louis Deluc Prize at Cannes, which is the award for new filmmakers. It had a César nomination for Best Debut, and Hanelle and Blanchard were both nominated for Most Promising Actress. So, there was a lot of the developmental awards attention here. It got an 82% on Rotten Tomatoes, had a 65% Metacritic. So critics were lukewarm about it, especially in American publications, which is what Metacritic has a bias for. We'll get into some of that later. It's a really strong debut that's very naturalistic. It stars Pauline Auquer as Marie, and Louis Blanchard as Anne, and Adèle Haenel as Floriane. And the story really follows these 3 girls as they're all 15 and going through some very different circumstances in life where, that's kind of the age where you start to depart in your friendships or change your friendships. The score is by Para One, who is an electronic music producer who has collaborated with Sciamma for most of her career.
So I have not read many reviews of this movie. What were the issues that American critics had that apparently it got super mixed reviews, and I'm just mystified because...
So, oh boy, you should dive into those reviews at some point.
Wait, let me guess. Were people uptight about how teenage sexuality was portrayed?
Yes, it was also intensely unsatisfying in its ending, apparently.
Okay.
Yeah.
Its ending is messy, unsatisfying, much like many
like
teenage
real life.
experiences. Yeah.
As we often see with feminist or queer cinema, the reviews that bombed the Rotten Tomatoes score, and again, this is an independent film, it didn't have many critical reviews, are head-scratching and kind of problematic.
I just don't get it.
Well, I guess we should start talking about what we like about this movie so we can maybe paint a picture of why all 3 of us are rather confused about
Yeah.
the response to this movie from certain segments of the film world.
I think the most genuine criticism that you see in those critical reviews is that the situation feels contrived.
That's interesting because
It felt very natural to me.
Well, it not only felt very natural, but I feel like this movie captures that period of adolescence very honestly and authentically.
Especially compared to a lot of coming of age cinema where they do feel contrived. This feels realistic and relatable, and there's no happy ending.
No, and nobody knows what they're doing, and there's this nebulousness to their like desires, or like they're just confused about everything.
So the film, it's summer in a suburb of France. And we have these three middle-class teenagers, Marie, Anne, and Florian. The entire plot kind of revolves around this synchronized swimming competition. Anne and Florian both compete in the synchronized swimming team. Marie is an outsider. She's really a bit of a quiet fish out of water when we first meet her, but she's intensely watching. She's intensely watching their competition from the sidelines. You kind of get the sense that she's watching with more than sporting interest, and it quickly becomes pretty clear that Marie has a bit of a crush on Florian, played by Adèle Haenel. She is best friends with Anne, who is really pining for male attention, and it seems Marie, for various reasons, doesn't seem to understand that. Anne is...
Yeah, so Marie has this, what seems at first to be an unrequited crush on a boy on the, I believe it's water polo team.
Yes. Yeah, they're playing water polo.
And this boy is romantically involved with Florian.
And Florian has rumors, like slut-shaming rumors, floating around her from all the other girls.
Yeah, that, they call her a slag, that she sleeps around, basically. That is the I'm trying to, like...
Our first impression of Florian.
Yeah, that
Her,
is
like,
our first
reputation.
impression. Her reputation.
Yeah.
Whether that is reality or not, the movie eventually gets into, but... Yeah, that's kind of the situation. And so a lot of the movie revolves around these very complicated social dynamics of this teenage social circle. Mm-hmm. And very quickly, things start getting muddy.
Marie starts to ignore Anne because she's actually getting some attention from Florian, which means everything starts to get a little resentful, a little tit for tat. Anne doesn't understand why Marie is suddenly busy all the time. Because Marie hasn't confided in her that she's attracted, that she's gay, that she's attracted to Florian. So there's this big void created by the distance created by the closet, and everything just kind of spirals for most of the movie.
Florian's character is interesting to me because I recognize her character, to me anyway, seems to really be wrestling with compulsory heterosexuality. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It is clear to me, like early on, that she is savvy and she recognizes like what is going on between her and Marie. And while she, on some level, also desires it, she also sees it as a way that she can manipulate Marie, or that she tries to play both sides. She tries to have her cake and eat it too. She wants to
She uses her affection to her advantage.
Yes.
Yeah, like their initial interactions when they hang out is Florian getting Marie to do things for her.
Right.
Like helping her make cover stories for like where she's going out. Just like wait for her while she goes and spends time with the boy on the water polo team. Francois,
that's his name. Yes.
Francois, who is Anne's crush. That is the messiest of messy dynamics.
I think it's an astonishing debut film.
The language displayed here,
especially, she was very young when she made it. She was 25.
Yeah, she was 25. She'd only made like a short film before that. It feels both. A lot of comparisons get made to Chantal Akerman, and I can see a lot of that. I also see a lot of like British feminist film of the 90s in it.
Yes.
I see a lot of Ratcatcher in this movie. The way in which the dynamics of navigating friendship and what is friendship, what is using someone, what is love, are so seamlessly molded together in this movie is really remarkable.
Like the thing that stood out to me, like with this movie and with all three is the fact that it doesn't give you piles of dialogue to focus on. It's very much like you hang out in the moment with those characters and you get a sense of their relationships through like those just extended scenes of them just quietly existing in the same space together. Like there's not a whole lot of spoon feeding, like who am I and what do I believe and whatever to an audience.
Sciamma is also a master of using eye lines. The characters, where their eyes are and what they're expressing with their eyes. I've never seen another director so consistently be able to tell an entire story just with glances.
Yes. And boy, will we get into that with
Portrait of
the
a Lady on
third
Fire.
film we'll be discussing.
But no,
That movie's a masterclass in doing that.
you know, I had not seen this since seeing Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And returning and looking at the glances, really watching the Carrie of Florian and seeing how she's playing Marie with her glances is really, it's an interesting thing to return to because there's not a lot of dialogue. We don't get a real conversation about attraction in this movie. There's impulses, and then when we get dialogue, it's very frank. It's very, I haven't slept with anyone, which is something Florian reveals eventually, and she wants Marie to be her first. You know, it's there's almost a disconnect between like emotional attraction and sex, where emotional attraction is something you feel and something you imply, and sex is something more blunt.
And especially because it's a coming of age movie, it's about people first unpacking like what is emotional attraction, what's the difference between emotional attraction and physical attraction. Like
we have endless amounts of references to acts of making out, acts of sex, whatever. That it's all very unemotional in how it's presented. And then we have this...
And it's also kind of ritualized.
Oh, totally. This is what you do. This is, you go to a party, you grab a boy,
going through the motions, like...
You're practicing for your husband. And that, I think, one way where Sciamma is subtly tearing down, you know, the heteronormative expectations of the culture.
Going back to something I was saying earlier, is I think part of that also is, like, the way Sciamma uses the character of Florian to explore these ideas of, you know, there are so many external forces coming down on you during this period, like this very formative period, that essentially communicating very specific things about like how life is, like the order of things and what you are supposed to be doing. And so we see this conflict in that character because obviously she has some kind of emergent queer desire, but she's still desperate to be seen as, you know, this very typical teenage girl.
Yep.
We see her contradictory behavior is sort of, it's like, you know, she's being pulled in these two different directions.
We also have two films here where Adèle Haenel is playing a character who is basically circumstantially trapped and reverting to presenting as heterosexual.
Right. Now, her character in Portrait of a Lady on Fire has a lot less freedom to do anything else, arguably, than this character, but...
Absolutely, but there's still expectations, and at the end...
Exactly.
At the end of the film, we are left with Florian makes the choice where all she really wants Marie for is someone that she can use as an escape from social circumstances.
Yeah. Something that many a queer woman can relate to. I certainly can. Being in Marie's position, specifically, of like being used by like women who are basically emotional vampires who treat you as like their plaything.
And then they're just waiting for a man.
Go back to their hetero life because, Yeah.
And then the film ends leaving like Marie and Anne in their own outside world, which they're still together, but that relationship also hasn't been mended. So you're kind of left with like the damage of what's happened throughout the movie with them drawing apart. And you get a sense they're going to like, they still like care about each other at the end and they're together in the pool, but they're still like kind of outside of, and Anne's chosen to leave a situation as well, which I thought was very interesting.
Yes. Anne has left a situation which was using her sexually. Do we see a queer reading of them? Because at times when Anne is complaining about the lack of attention from Marie, I can almost see an attraction angle there. I'm not sure if that's intended or not.
I could see how it could be read that way. I mean, I think the like homoerotic friendship angle is like way more pronounced in the Marie Florian interactions. But yeah, like certainly I think there is room for that interpretation.
We kind of end with these characters all on the cusp of a lot of change in their life. So who knows where these characters would be in 5 years.
Right.
What about the portrayals of masculinity in this film?
I think that like that is really on the periphery. Like
Men are not important in this movie, except Francois is a chess piece.
Yeah. He's an object of desire for some of the characters.
And then an object of manipulation.
Yeah, and then an object of manipulation.
And that's really that's kind of it. Like there is not much to his character beyond that.
There's not much masculinity in this film at all.
No.
But ultimately the impetus for Florian wanting to sleep with Marie is that her parents are away and Francois is going to expect to be given that invitation, and she doesn't want him to be her first.
Well, she specifically doesn't want him to think that she is a virgin.
Yes.
She says that. I believe she's talking to Marie when she says this, that she wants to go find a random guy to have sex with so that when she has sex with Francois, he won't be surprised that she's a virgin because she has this reputation she needs to uphold of being like,
and upholding that reputation as its own like microcosm of sexism right there.
Yes.
Yeah, like following the script of what she sees as the correct set of actions that she needs to take to meet it's like theater. She's like playing a role.
She is the slutty girl. That is her social standing in her circle of girls.
And it's a way for her to reinforce the notion of heterosexuality.
Absolutely.
Also.
No one's going to suspect her. Absolutely, 100%. Let's talk about that night. We have Marie she does not want to go along with this. And that's kind of surprising almost.
It is, but it's also not, because it's a jealousy thing, because she realizes that even if they have this sexual encounter, it's about the man. It's not about her. It's not about their connection.
Absolutely.
Right.
And then we have one of the most uncomfortable sexual interactions in film history.
I feel like I could provide way, way more uncomfortable examples than this, but
I'm okay, thanks.
Just like
I get very anxious watching movies, and this was my first time seeing both Water Lilies and Tomboy. So I had to like pause the movie and do like a few laps in the room. I was like, all right.
I'm just saying,
all right. We got to get back in there.
You could she could be reading a book while she's fingering her, and nothing would change in that scene. Nothing.
Yeah, it's just completely. It's not eroticized at all. It is not an erotic.
It is
event.
a physical
it
act.
It is completely
zero emotional, which is kind
perfunctory.
Going through the motions,
which is wild because every interaction we've seen between the two of them up to that point is entirely like this very heightened emotional connection.
Yeah, it's very charged.
Yeah. Well, this scene is like, again, like what you said, Adriana, like totally about the man, so to speak. So like you lose all of that emotional connection that the two of them had because they're doing this act not because of the relationship they have and the bond that they've formed over the film. So, and you're just kind of left feeling very empty afterwards. You're like, oh, I feel gross. This is awful.
And like Marie didn't get anything out of that situation. It's entirely
no. She was being used, and she knew it.
And then Francois basically
does the same thing
to Anne.
Yeah.
Florian turns him down, and then he just moves on that same night and shows up at Anne's house. The consent issues in that scene play very poorly.
Yeah.
There's no conversation. She got what she thought she desired, but it sure doesn't look like she's enjoying the experience.
No, she freezes up, like her body locks up, and it stays that way for basically the duration of their encounter. And he either is oblivious or doesn't care that she is not engaged or enjoying herself in any way.
This is intensely palpable.
And I mean, a lot of teenage encounters happen like that. Like, it was a very realistic depiction of a kind of sexual encounter that is unfortunately very common still, even for young people.
It's equally emotionally detached. You know, it's not even... I think we're supposed to infer that he didn't care about her at all. She was just willing.
She's just putting out.
She was willing, and he knew that. But also... he's not trying to make it pleasant for her. He's not trying to do anything particularly emotionally fulfilling or even about her. He's just looking for someone to,
Florian turns him down and he's like, well, I can just go sleep with Anne, like whatever. I have a backup plan.
They've barely even had a conversation at this.
They've had, they're basically nothing because she gave the necklace to him that he then gave to Florian. And that's one of the two interactions they've really had in the movie.
And her faking walking a dog, which is actually Marie's dog. I'll just borrow your dog to go pick up a guy.
I thought that scene was super funny, actually. Like, she's just walking by. She's like, I'm walking my dog.
I've been sitting outside your apartment for,
Nothing weird happening here. Just hanging.
It's one of those many moments in this movie that are just such a genuine example of how terribly awkward teenagers are.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I liked the scenes where Anne and Marie are just hanging out and having their, like, young teenage friends moments, and they become fewer and far between over the course of the film. But at the beginning, when they're just, like, hanging out in the house and Marie's trying to, like, work out and then they're just chatting, I really enjoyed their, like, friendship, and also was just like, whenever I watch movies where friends, like, drift apart, I spend the whole movie being, like, invested in the friendship. I want the friends to fall back in love, so to speak.
Yeah.
Not necessarily romantic love, but, like, that's to me the point of the relationship, I guess.
And we don't get that full reparation because their friendship hasn't repaired.
Yeah.
They're able to experience things, and it almost feels like they're trying to return to the past, but events have changed.
Yeah, you can't go back.
One scene that always sticks in my head is when they're at the mall and they go to the McDonald's, and that the conversation that they have at the table where Marie is very cruel to Anne.
She's so mean.
What I find so striking about that scene is that it so perfectly captures just how mean teenagers can be to each other, even friends.
Absolutely.
And also, it should be pointed out that the previous scene has a director cameo.
Yeah.
Which I never noticed until this most recent watch for this podcast.
Yeah, you pointed that out, and I'd never thought of that before. But yeah,
I think it's because the last time I watched this, I don't think I knew what she looked. Well, that's not true. I did know what she looked like, but I just didn't notice.
Yeah, it's Sciamma behind the counter.
Behind the counter at the McDonald's.
Let's talk about Para One, who has been Sciamma's consistent collaborator throughout her career. It feels authentically... Well, it's diegetic at times, because there's the whole scene at the nightclub where that is original music, which is diegetically placed.
But most of it is non-diegetic.
Yeah, most of it is non-diegetic. And it feels timely. I could totally buy this being 2007, because it is a contemporary movie.
Yeah.
It also just feels very fresh.
Yeah,
and
like
exciting.
It could have come out now.
Yeah. The use of a non-traditional score really suits this movie, and Sciamma also knows when to not have music.
Yeah.
Or when something else is needed, like, because a lot of the score is this very moody, atmospheric synth music, but occasionally it will become orchestral. There will be strings.
Yeah.
And that tends to underscore more overtly dramatic moments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the score really works for me. I really like it.
Moving on to the next film in Sciamma's, like, girlhood trilogy is Tomboy, which came out in 2011. It can be found on out-of-print Blu-ray releases by Picadillo Pictures in the UK. You can also, if you're really feeling fancy, you can purchase a very expensive Korean box set by Plane,
which is also out of print.
The DVD was released from Wolf Video in the US, which is also out of print, but you can find it streaming on Criterion.
Please, Criterion, please. Pretty please. Blu-ray release. Thank you.
It won the Jury Award for Best LGBT Movie at Berlin. IndieWire ranked it in 2017 as the third best lesbian movie of all time, behind Mulholland Drive and But I'm a Cheerleader. It has a 96% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 74% on Metacritic.
And Roger Ebert was really a champion in this movie as well. He really put a lot into making sure that people heard about this film. I know that was the first time I heard about this film. Was he, at the end of the awards year, was really pushing this as one of the best films of 2011. The film stars Zoe Haran as Laure or Michael, and Malone Levana as Jean, her sister, and Jean Desson as Lisa, along with Sophie Catani as her mother, as Laura's mother, and Matthew Demy as their father. Matthew Demy, of course, being the son of Jacques Demy and Agnes Varda. So before we talk about this movie, as far as its plot, as far as its themes, we should probably talk about the elephant in the room here, which is this a movie about a lesbian or bisexual woman struggling to deal with gender assumptions and gender roles? Or is this a movie about a trans child? And Sciamma herself has said that while she reviews Laura as female, she totally accepts that it, and she intentionally made it so that it was a valid reading of the movie, that you could read them as non-binary or trans. So like how we talk about and how we discuss this movie is something that probably we should set some context for.
Yeah, and I mean, we were discussing this before we recorded, and Kyle, you made the point that part of the problem is that while this is an excellent film, there is an issue with the fact that it doesn't really have a solid language of gender identity. And so the way that their identity is depicted is a little confusing. And I had made the point that it was sort of similar to the way that a lot of filmmakers would conflate drag with trans identity and with cross-dressing, which are three distinct things. And in this movie, it's sort of, there isn't like a very good understanding of what is trans versus what is gender play. Yeah, it's a little muddy.
And quite frankly, it feels a little, it's disappointing even by the standards of 2011, quite frankly, in that aspect. Today, I don't think this movie would be made the same way at all.
No, I don't either. Now, but we should be clear, like, it isn't a disaster on this front. Like,
No, and I think it's realistic for they're in a small suburb of Paris. It's, it's contemporary to the late aughts. It feels authentic that people are not very educated about queer issues in this community.
Yes.
There is not language to describe gender, which I think until very recently was common.
and that's fair. That's a very good point.
Even their mother, I'll use they, them pronouns for this discussion, I think. Their mother manages to identify that something is going on with the child as far as identity, but doesn't have like the mental space to go there. So she just forces her child to bury it, to conform.
And it's worth pointing out that prior to this, she seemed to be very accepting or at least tolerant of the fact that her daughter was a tomboy.
Yep.
It was only when she learned about this Mikkel persona that it became a huge problem.
Well, first of all, it was something that she was perceiving as a lie, which, wow, we can dissect that from a trans identity angle and transphobia angle all day. But also, it was something that she found out after being confronted by another parent. So there might be an embarrassment angle as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that scene where she's trying to force the dress on her was so triggering for me.
Yeah. And then making her go out.
Watch.
Making her go out and confront her. Oh, it's really...
It's so humiliating. Like, it was bringing back all kinds of really horrible memories for me.
I was really surprised. Again, this was my first time watching the film. And I, from like my background, was like super surprised that the parents were letting like Laura play with her like presentation of identity as much, like wearing baggy shorts, wearing t-shirts, having short hair, like for all intents and purposes, passing as a boy. I was like super surprised by that. So I was like, oh, like, of course they're accepting of their identity and whatever. And then like the Uno reverse at the very end point of the movie where like her mom or their mom finds out about the Mikkel persona. I was just like, oh my gosh, I had a totally wrong reading on this because of how warm and loving so many of the family scenes are up until that point in the film. Like the movie goes out of its way to show like such a tender point of view of siblinghood and such a tender angle of like parent and child relationships that then when their mother turns around and makes Laura put on a dress and like goes and makes them apologize to, like, it's just so traumatic and awful that I was,
Well, it's making a point that, you know, a lot of people can be very affirming and accepting under certain circumstances, but then once they are confronted with something that makes them uncomfortable, that acceptance will be withdrawn with the swiftness.
Yeah.
And really, it's Laura drew attention to themselves.
Exactly.
And that starts to threaten their mother's social circle. That starts to ask questions. That makes them stand out. In the past, we really saw that Laura doesn't stand out. They stand on the sidelines. they don't engage. So that's a whole different reality. It's one thing to understand your kid is playing with presentation, playing with aesthetics, or just not that feminine. It's another thing to say it.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about how this movie was shot. Like, I feel like there's such an incredible verisimilitude to
Oh my gosh, yeah.
everything. I mean, you had made a comparison earlier about, how it evokes British kitchen sink realism.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you could easily compare a movie like this to, something by Terrence Davies.
Absolutely. It has that Davies, it has that Ramsey. I also think Ackerman is a
Oh, Ramsey, yeah.
I'm sorry, I see nothing but Ratcatcher in this movie. It would be such a great double feature to talk about this with Ratcatcher. They feel
That
so
is definitely
linked.
a better point of comparison.
Just the aesthetics of identity. And I know Ratcatcher doesn't have the queer themes going on. Though that said, I do read the protagonist of Ratcatcher as queer.
So do I.
It doesn't have that explicitly spelled out like this does. But man, the aesthetics, the way childhood's portrayed, especially the play scenes. Ramsey is the only other filmmaker I can think of who is able to capture just childhood play in such a natural way where it feels totally unscripted and totally a natural relationship between these kids, but also they hit all their marks.
Yeah, those scenes really stood out to me. Like when I was writing notes, I was like, the child performances, even for like the group children, the phenomenal.
So
It's
authentic.
amazing.
It's so authentic. And the sibling relationship as well is both so playful but nurturing.
It's so beautiful. That's one of my favorite
sweet.
aspects of the film.
I like wrote siblings in like all caps. I was like,
And, talk about the cinematography. This is shot on DSLR, which for those who don't know, these are small cameras. These are the cameras that are usually still photography. This is the first generation of movies that were shot like that. The technology had only been around for about a year or two prior. So what does that allow you to do? That allows you to get your set much smaller and to make things much more intimate.
And she certainly succeeded with this movie.
It also looks really good for an early 2000s DSLR production. That was the era where I was in film school, and it can be very challenging to get results that look that good out of that movie. But no, this film looks great. The composition's gorgeous. There's a real painterly quality to the cinematography throughout this film that portrays childhood in such a positive light.
one of the scenes that is one of my favorite scenes is the dinner scene, which is just before like Laura or Mikkel's like secret is out, where their sister is talking about how they've been out playing, and they were like, oh, well, my favorite person is Mikkel. He carries me on his back and like he's my friend. And like it's just I do kind of read the movie as it being like a trans story, and the more I'm thinking about it, and like that particular scene is so warming.
It's
like
such
to have a
'cause
sibling just look at you and be like, yeah.
Well,
I got
and
you.
right before that, we have the scene of her talking to Lisa, and she describes how great having a big brother is.
Yeah.
And like that's anytime transphobes are like kids can't understand gender identity, kids can understand gender identity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so wholesome, and it's a role that also I think we kind of see Laura is very caring for his sister in the earlier scenes, doesn't seem to quite know how to interact. While as Mikkel, he slips into that role much more seamlessly. I think it's just an interesting dynamic of what an older sister versus an older brother is that is portrayed really well. And of course, it's very funny that, she's also making a joke about about identity in front of their parents without any indication given. That is a remarkable amount of care by a 6-year-old.
Yeah, I was going to say some very excellent emotional intelligence. One of the other dynamics I found really interesting in this film is like Laura and Mikkel's social interactions with girls versus boys, because when they're playing soccer with the boys, they're trying very, very hard to like fit in and do everything as a boy. But then in turn, also when they go over to like Lisa's house and they dance with Lisa and they do makeup and things like that, it's the two like contrasts of worlds, and then they're in the middle. It just really hits you.
And Lisa clocks them right off the bat as being different.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need to talk about Lisa.
The only girl in this friend group, which Laura and his family have just moved there They don't know anyone. Lisa's the only girl in this friend group. And like in general, you can probably assume that she is a tomboy.
Yeah.
She is hanging out with all these boys roughhousing, but she is apart because she is a girl. And the boys know that, so they treat her differently.
And Mikkel knows that too, and that's I feel like that's partly why they are taking on this male persona, because there is something about these boys that they deeply relate to, and they know that they need to project masculinity in order to be respected by these kids.
There is no room for Lore to play with the idea of masculinity, while there is room for Mikkel to play with the idea of masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
And there is room for Mikkel to play with the idea of femininity as well. I think that's an interesting double standard.
Yes.
Even though they feel resistant to the idea of femininity as and uncomfortable as Lisa is, putting makeup on them and saying you look good as a girl, you can tell also there's a little bit that they engage with there. Gender is complicated, and I think that's something that they are struggling to find on their own, because I don't think they've ever had makeup in a masculine identity presented to them.
Right. Or that you could do that.
Yeah.
That these things are not binary.
Right.
Right. And the complication of also having that interaction with like a person you're developing feelings for
Yeah.
as well.
Putting makeup on someone else outside of an educational setting is a profoundly intimate act.
It is.
You know every flaw of that person's skin. There's a lot of touch. There's a lot of caress. Like, that is a very intimate act.
Yeah. And also knowing how this movie ends. When I was watching that scene, I now fully believe this, but before I knew how the movie ended, when I was watching that scene, it seemed to me that there is this suggestion that Lisa may not be as shocked to learn that Mikkel is actually Laura as we might expect. And then at the end, after she learns that the truth, she ultimately goes back to her and says, like, hey, like, fine with me.
And that's the moment where Lore identifies as Lore.
Right.
In the finale of the film, which is that them conforming, or is that them being comfortable with their own name and defining their own identity? That is a wide open room for speculation right there.
Part of the reason why Laura took on this persona was because she felt like she couldn't interact with this girl she liked in the way that she wanted because of her gender.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because of a heteronormative culture. Yep.
Right.
100%.
Which, I mean, that's kind of like, we should be careful in how we discuss this too, because like it's easy to then veer into like a weird turf rhetoric.
I think it gets very messy because this film really doesn't have language for gender.
Yeah. Again, it doesn't have a super coherent like logic to how like gender identity is presented.
There's also, I think, beyond attraction is very clearly experiencing gender dysphoria, though.
Yeah.
We see this. There's a number of scenes in which you see them looking at their own body, looking at their own prepubescent breasts, and you feel that impending doom in the shots.
Yeah.
I can't help but make comparisons to the film My Life as a Dog and the friend in My Life as a Dog, and the understanding that your ability to pass is going away every day.
Mm-hmm.
Or going back to the scene where the dress is being forced on.
Yeah.
Like, that is a violation.
They shut down. They shut down emotionally. You can see everything, their entire face.
Yeah.
Like, the light goes out.
I viscerally felt that scene because I have been in that situation.
I've been in the room, watched someone be forced to present in a way that they did not want to as a child, where a child often doesn't even have the language to express what is being done wrong to them. It is such a painful scene of abuse. Yeah. And this is a maternal figure who we've had this intensely positive, loving relationship throughout the entire film until that point.
It's such a betrayal.
Yeah, it's a betrayal. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. It's quite frankly, I don't care what the mother thinks or what her opinion is after that point in the movie. She failed her child.
Yeah.
And I think we're supposed to feel that.
Yeah.
We can feel this intense disconnect. We don't really have an interaction between the two of them after that. It's brutal. And not only to make them present as female, but then make them confront their friends and tell the so-called truth. Is devastating. And we see the ramifications of this. They become a bit of a freak show to the boys. The boys are talking. It's very painful.
That scene is the one that sticks with me, is when they're being chased by the boys because they're like, we have to check and see if you're a real boy or not.
Oh my God.
Oh my gosh. I was...
And then they make Lisa.
Yeah, it's awful.
They make Lisa
so
essentially do a
upsetting.
general inspection,
Yeah.
which is something that we have in our national discourse right now,
Yep.
thanks to GOP assholes who think that who are
Unhinged
hyper obsessed
transphobes.
with the genitals of children, and the pain in Lisa's face, knowing that she has to do this in order to continue to fit in her circumstance.
Yeah.
But she does anyway.
Right.
That is devastating, and I really wish, because she does vocalize that it shouldn't happen, and then does it anyway.
Yeah.
Under
Yeah.
pressure.
And that's like a failure then of everybody kind of in Laura's social circle. There's no one to really assist or turn to.
And Laura is very much a fish out of water throughout the entire film, and they don't vocalize their emotions very often.
Mm-hmm.
I really wonder, this is totally left out of the film, but I really wonder if their mother ever came to understand what they went through as a result of those actions.
Yeah.
Was there any healing there? Because
Yeah.
that's a horrible thing to put a 10-year-old through.
It's traumatic. I have a hard time understanding how someone would walk away from that.
It's like, does she not understand the weight?
Yeah, because even in the scene where the mom, like before they go to Lisa, but after they've gone to the kid that there was, Laura got into a fight with.
Which is the inciting incident. His mother outs
Yeah.
them.
Yeah, like the mom is trying to be like, what other solution can you think of? Which is awful. Why would you put a 10-year-old in the position of coming up with a solution that a perceived problem? Like, you know what I mean? Like, just to turn to a 10-year-old and be like, well, what's your solution then? Is, I think, one of the most awful things you could.
And again, this is
Say as a
contemporary
parent.
in the mid 2000s. They're in the Paris region. Like, there are gender clinics for kids. This is something that was entering common resources at the time. There are solutions. There was a really great documentary not long after this film came out about a trans elementary school kid in Paris. Petite Fille, little girl from 2020. Which, okay, so yeah, it's about a decade on from this. And it does portray that even just getting a school to accept a trans kid to go by their chosen name and pronouns is an ongoing struggle in otherwise progressive regions.
It's really frustrating.
And like, it doesn't seem to have the same overt transphobia that we're used to, but just an utter lack of acceptance.
It's like a sure, whatever, but like, don't expect me to make any extra effort.
But this is not how things are.
Exactly. It's like, I do love the shot when Laura hangs the dress up on a tree and then walks down the path away from it. I very much like,
Casting off.
yeah. And
Yeah.
despite everything that's just happened.
I think that's for me the biggest confirmation that they are not female and just experimenting with presentation, that they do not see themselves as female. The more I think about this reading, the more I just...
Which is interesting because
Cannot
Sciamma
get on with
herself
that.
has said the opposite. That,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But Sciamma has also said that it's intentionally open to interpretation.
sure.
And I can't get on with that. But this is also me approaching this with a 2024 lens, where the number of non-binary youth who have accepted and reached an understanding of their identity has shot through the roof in the last decade. So would they discover this then in 2011, or would they discover this a decade later is a whole other aspect. The language to express gender identity has changed dramatically just in a decade.
Yeah, and also gender is a journey, and we don't know where lore goes after this.
Right.
Yeah. I do think, again, talking about eye lines, Zoe Haran, her face lights up throughout this movie. You can see every emotion without dialogue needing to convey it.
Yeah, I mean, so far the actors, like very young actors in these two movies, are quite adept at a young age at being able to dramatize their interiority through their face, through just expression.
And at that age, yes, the actors are great, but you have to give a lot of that credit to the director.
That's very true.
The director was able to communicate exactly what was necessary to achieve the emotions that you're looking for throughout the entire film. And that's incredible. I mean, the performance by Malone Lavana as Jean, she is 6 years old, is unparalleled. It's really disappointing that those performances were not honored more.
You know, it's really rare to have child performances, especially at 6, that feel as authentic and carry a scene by themselves.
The biggest comparison I can think of is Ratcatcher again, because again, those childhood relationships feel very authentic. But even in Ratcatcher, the younger daughter in Ratcatcher is Lynn Ramsey's own child. So like that's very different. So like being able to cast a kid and get these performances out of it is fantastic. So our final film is the one you've probably heard of, Sciamma's Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which came out in 2019. It is available in the US from Criterion and in the UK from Artificial Eye, and it is exclusively streaming on Hulu. This was a huge movie in 2019. It won the Queer Palm and Best Screenplay Awards at Cannes. It was nominated for 10 Caesar Awards, including Best Film, Best Director, Best Actress for both the leads, Most Prominent Actress, which is an up-and-coming award for Luana Barjama, Best Original Screenplay, Best Sound, Best Costume Design, Best Production, and then it won Best Cinematography. However, this was not without controversy because the best film wound up going to Roman Polanski, and Sciamma basically vocally dissented in giving the award to an abuser and stormed out while flipping off the Caesar Awards judges during the ceremony. Noemi Merlant and Adele Hanel did follow her and express similar protests, so that's kind of a microcosm of the war Sciamma has waged with the French establishment and the ways they have protected abusers consistently, be it Polanski, Besson, etc.
Christophe Rougia,
who was an abuser of Adele Hanel.
It's still wild to me that this was not the movie France submitted as their film for Academy Award. Like,
this was not submitted to the Oscars as the Academy Award nomination for international film by the French officials. They instead submitted Lilies, Les Miserables, which is a fantastic film. It is a fantastic film. It is diverse. It has great displays of class disparity. It is really a triumph of French cinema. I don't know that I would have done differently. Now, Portrait of a Lady on Fire was my number one pick of movies for 2019. I think it was yours as well, Adriana.
2019 feels like a lifetime ago. I can't even remember
anything.
It was
COVID-19.
To say the very least, it was way up on my list.
Yeah, but Les Miserables is right behind it for me. It was just a really great year for French cinema. And if you're playing movie awareness, I think the Academy voters are going to be more receptive.
That's true, for sure.
Yeah.
To Les Miserables.
I can understand the strategy.
It's more appealing to the older white men, just saying.
Yeah. And a known story that is well liked.
I can confirm it was my number one. I just found up on the Steel Stacks website. My list was there, and it was number one. My number two of 2019 was Pain and Glory.
Ooh, yes, that's a good one. Yeah, to be clear, Les Miserables is not an adaptation of the classics of the classic book.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah,
I totally thought it was just a French adaptation of.
It makes
the
a lot of
novel.
references to it, but it's not. It's about racism in Paris, which is
a huge problem.
Yeah.
yeah. No, it's a fantastic film, but a lot of people didn't see it, so a lot of people don't know that. Portrait of a Lady on Fire did very well critically. It has a 98% Rotten Tomatoes. It has a 95% Metacritic. It made tons of critics' best of lists. Mark Kermode called it one of the best films of the decade. It won Best Cinematography from the New York Film Critics Circle and from LAFCA. It was nominated for a Spirit Award for Best International Film, where it lost once again to Les Miserables. I'm still upset about that. That voting was very close as a Spirit Awards member. It really was this kind of zeitgeist of art cinema. So much so that in 2022, when Sight and Sound, the famous British film publication, updated its list of the greatest films of all time, which they do every 20 years, it wound up at position 30 only 3 years after its release. That's the highest of any film of the 2010s. It's also, this is a list that 20 years ago had no films directed by women on that list. So it's just kind of a remarkable achievement.
And isn't that funny that there's never an agenda when everything is homogenous towards white straight men, but then the second things start to diversify, suddenly it's rigged, or there's an agenda, or
Well, just because they were like, oh wait, we have no female filmmakers voting on this, we should fix this. Suddenly, just having some diversity is an agenda.
Yeah, imagine that when you open the accessibility, or who gets to vote on these things, and you make it more diverse. Yeah, the results are going to be more diverse because
we went from
the pool got larger. There's more perspective.
Exactly. And I believe in the previous two iterations, the number one film of all time was either Vertigo or Citizen Kane.
Yeah.
And the new list, it was Chantal Akerman's Jean Dillman, which is obviously a huge influence on Sciamma. So we have this dramatic shift. I can't think of a more dramatic shift to a female perspective than suddenly having Jean Dillman be the number one film. We'll be talking about Jean Dillman later this year, but just such a shift not only in the perspective given, but also moving that into a discussion of kitchen sink and class issues. We're starting to see a lot of retrospective looking at naturalist and kitchen sink movements as just the great films of value that they are. Another big, very hyped aspect of this movie is that it was shot in the VistaVision format of digital sensor size on a Red Monstro camera, which has become fairly commonplace in the last few years. But when this was coming out, it was very odd to see what would be regarded as an art house movie have this kind of epic cinematography. That, the aesthetics of using those larger lenses give a very painterly scope to how everything is rendered. One of the biggest takeaways is this film just looks different than a lot of art films.
It also looks dramatically different from her previous films, and certainly the two that we have already discussed on this episode. It has a much more cinematic look to it.
And there was a change in the cinematographer, which is part of that. Claire Mathon, who is one of the greatest French cinematographers, has won a ton of Lumiere's awards.
She shot something I really, really like that I'm now blanking on. Stranger by the Lake. And also
Stranger by the Lake
Spencer.
is fantastic. Spencer.
But Stranger by the Lake is what made Sciamma want to work with her. She loved how she photographed natural light. And so that was that is really the catalyst for her reaching out.
Stranger by the Lake is a fantastic work. She also shot Atlantique, which I liked quite a lot. She shot Saint Omar last year.
Oh, that was a fantastic movie.
Yeah, and it was beautifully shot. But yeah, she's worked with Sciamma twice now. Portrait of a Lady on Fire and Petite Maman. Very different films aesthetically. And Petite Maman almost feels like it's more in line with the rest of Sciamma's work. Sciamma is these very tight shots, these very intimate shots where you can read a character's face. I think the joy of Portrait of a Lady on Fire is she's able to use, it's a film about painters. It's a film where you have this very classical approach to art, this classical approach to human form and lighting. So the light is always very intentional and very subjective to the aesthetics of the people. And she's able to do that and almost always portrays people in either medium or wide shots, but still achieve that incredible amount of eye language and facial reactions and body language that you get in her other films in these tight shots. And I think that's really the striking accomplishment that makes this film work as well as it does.
Yeah, and also to your point about the tight shots and also the focus on eyes and gazing is that Sciamma really understands that one of the most erotic things is the promise of desire eventually fulfilled and not the consummation of that desire. It's the yearning and the staring and the stolen glances and touch that are really erotically charged.
None of her movies have particularly erotic feeling sex scenes, which is crazy given so many of her films are about desire.
Yeah.
And you can very palpably feel the eroticism of that desire. So I think that's very interesting that she's able to do so much with looks.
Yeah.
And before and after the characters sleep together, she's able to communicate so much just in those expressions. Honestly, this film does not have a lot of nudity in it for how intense the attraction is. This film surrounds the life of a painter, and the paintings that were used in the movie were made by a real-life artist, Hélène Delmar, who worked on set and was able to look at the blocking and staging and paint to reflect that in a style appropriate for the late 18th century. The other aspect is, of course, music, which we have almost no music throughout the entire movie. We'll get into that in the plot in a second when we talk about the background that Heloise is coming out of. You have this intensely moving a cappella piece. And then in the finale, you have Vivaldi's The Four Seasons. And that is the only music throughout the movie.
Well, there's also the scene on the harpsichord, but it is the same music. Like, she's playing that piece.
She's playing Vivaldi's The Four. Yeah, she's playing.
But I think it's important to mention that it gets introduced early on in one context, and then that context is what then makes the second appearance of this piece very, very rich with meaning.
Along with the understanding that Heloise has come from a Benedictine convent.
Yeah.
kind of music is just not part of their life. Yeah, it really exaggerates the effect of the music when it comes into the film, because the rest of the time you just hear the soundscape. You hear the sea, you hear the crackling of the fire.
Yeah.
You hear the brushstrokes. It's almost like a sensory deprivation thing. So the film stars Noémie Merlant as Marianne, Adèle Haenel once again as Heloise, Luana Bargimi as Sophie, and Valeria Galino as the Countess.
So, as Kyle mentioned before, it follows the life of a painter, Marianne, who's basically been hired to paint a wedding portrait for this young noblewoman who is said to be married soon. The catch is she can't know that she's getting her portrait painted because she's refuses to pose. So Marianne goes to this remote island in Brittany where she is basically having to paint this portrait on the DL with a cover story of just spending time with Heloise on the beach doing walks.
She's her walking companion.
She's her walking companion, which is beautiful. How does one get a walking companion? Anyway.
I was going to say, that is the most perfect sapphic cover story I've ever heard.
Yeah, exactly. It seems that there was a previous painter that she's already worn through, or a character describes as she's already been through one painter. But as they start to spend time together in this remote area, they start to fall in love. Marianne learns about how trapped Heloise is in her position where she, seemed to be very happy where she was. She was in a Benedictine convent. And then she had an older sister who was set to be married. And I'm just going to put a pin in that. Do we want to speculate? I feel like the movie very clearly implies that her sister
to read that her sister
reads
died
that
by suicide.
Yeah, but she has this older sister who the movie basically and all but directly says that her sister died by suicide, and now, as is the social expectation, Heloise now has to basically take her place and be married to a man from Milan that she's never met, and she has no control over this, and this is going to be her life now. So it's these last few days of painting the portrait are her last days of freedom, so to speak. And what starts out as just a job for Marianne turns out to be this very emotional, complicated interaction wherein Marianne, partway through the film, now she's become so attached to her subject, has to repaint the portrait to be a true reflection of who she is, who Heloise is, and not just an object to please a man, exactly.
This is also clearly a generational break, because Heloise's mother had the same circumstance happen, essentially, where a portrait is painted of her to be sent to the man, to give him pleasure, to convince him to marry her. So this is a breaking of a cycle.
What I find interesting, maybe a little meta here, but the use of a portrait in that era, you don't have film. A portrait is how to view a person, or a viewing of a person. And so I like that this movie, which is also made, it's a view of women, it's a story about women, and you, the viewer, are watching these characters who are the object of the story. It mirrors the point of the portrait at the beginning. She is objectified in the first portrait, and she is fully realized in the second portrait. Mm-hmm. And I think that mirrors really nicely with the fact that you, the viewer, are also watching a film about these people.
And then we have Marianne's drawings and sketches, which provide a more accurate depiction, because people are not two-dimensional.
Right. It's down to earth and more grounded. And this film is also quite a bit about being a woman in that era and the various things that come with that. You see in Heloise being trapped in a marriage that she can't escape. You see that in Marianne having to submit paintings in her father's name, or pretend to be, or who has to paint portraits of men in secret and things like that, just because of her gender. She's not allowed to paint certain kinds of portraits. You see that in the maid who works in the house, Sophie, who is pregnant and also has to basically figure out how to get an abortion over the course of the film. And the focus of the story is these three women sort of living for what for them is an everyday circumstance, but for you, the viewer, is a glimpse into a life, and not necessarily it's something that you can resonate really deeply with, but also shows you something as well. It teaches without being condescending, if that makes sense.
also Sophie is constantly in a state of being an other from, there are three classes here. Heloise is a noble, Marianne is a merchant class, and Sophie is a peasant. And the moment that matters of pregnancy come into play, they are all equally screwed.
And also the way that like their isolation in this area means that the roles in each of those classes get played with so much, because once Sophie is pregnant, you suddenly find that Heloise is like, you see her cooking and preparing meals with an apron on. You see Marianne looking after Sophie. Like you see the class kind of disappears in that moment, even though it's very present in other parts of the film.
Well, this is also a time period where the Countess, Heloise's mother, is away. And we can't remove the fact that this is the late 18th century in France. Like, let's be real. There's a decent chance Marianne does not have her head in 10 years. So that is a whole aspect there as well. One of these people is about to experience a lot of change. So we're starting to see these rumblings of, we don't have a year given, but we know it's the late 18th century. The idea of the Third Estate and the idea of liberty and egalitarian politics are definitely in the air. Is that realized yet? No. Like, the end of the film, we still see this upper crust society, but it's brewing. And that kind of feels like a motivator of they're the generation that is changing.
Something else this movie does is kind of reassert the presence of women into art history, which, you know, there's this like, this common idea that women just were not there, or they, to Sarah's point earlier, the level of accessibility to art and like art making was maybe not on the same level as men at that time, but like there absolutely were women artists working at that time period.
Yeah, and making great art.
100%.
Like,
yeah.
And that great art to be recognized would often have to be submitted in the name of a man.
Exactly.
Which kind of, this is maybe skipping ahead to the end, but to that point, like you get like the rumblings throughout the film. At the end of the movie though, like they don't get a happy ending where they get to be together. All three of those characters have to resume whatever position they had at the beginning of the film in society, while forever changed by their experiences. Like at the very end of the film, like Marianne is enjoying this unveiling. Like she's watching the unveiling of one of her paintings, but it's under her father's name. It's a beautiful painting. It's, you know, but she's not going to be recognized for it because it's not, she couldn't submit it in her name. Heloise is married, and Sophie, for all intents and purposes, is like still on that island, probably will never leave.
Right.
Marianne, you almost get the sense that prior she wasn't aware of the privilege she has as a merchant, because she both has means to be, you know, independent to some extent and to have a little bit of mobility, but she is not a noble who has expectations.
Right.
She's not rich enough where she's locked in. And that's, I think that's a very meaningful separation as we look into what's going to happen during the French Revolution, how the winds of change that are on the horizon, because she fully realizes by the end of this how trapped society holds people. Right.
You're getting like these slice of life moments with these women in the time that the Countess is away. Marianne and Heloise's like relationship is blooming. They're assisting Sophie with helping her find like abortion access and things like that, which is another separate issue to discuss with this film. They're like reading together, which this is not, I don't think, a point of the film, but something that sat with me as a musician, which is the very sparse use of music, but how special music is in the movie to the characters. When in reality, like when you live in that era, music must be made by a person in a space with you. It cannot be something that you save for later to listen to on a recording or something. Like music is a very special and unique thing. And as is like storytelling, because I mean, I doubt Sophie can read. Heloise sitting with them around the table reading the story of Orpheus and Eurydice is a really like emotionally intimate thing to do, and sharing art across class, which I think is also really beautiful.
I mean, you even have at the beginning, Heloise says that she doesn't really know anything beyond church music because that's all they play in the monastery. Music is not portable. She has not been to a major city. She doesn't know. She's never seen an orchestra.
She doesn't know the sublimeness of Vivaldi. The story of Eurydice and Orpheus is the big like parallel to the story of Heloise and Marianne, where even I believe it's after they read that story together that as Marianne is going to bed each night, she's seeing a vision of Heloise behind her in the hallway. And when she turns to her, she vanishes.
Also, in each of those visions, Heloise is wearing a wedding dress.
Yes.
Is the impending fate. It's not the underworld. It's not the underworld. It's just being married to a man.
Right. And it's the death of her freedom and the death of her relationship. So she might as well. And I think a lot of ways, especially for Marianne. And they get into this discussion where Heloise is like, you own a part of me with this portrait and now you want all of me. Like you can't, like at the beginning of the movie, Marianne is trying to be emotionally supportive of Heloise entering this marriage. And now because she herself has fallen in love with her, she can't in a way be on her side. Complicates that dynamic between the two of them.
Absolutely. And it's a betrayal as well. But Heloise also challenges Marianne's privilege, which makes her be more reflective than she initially is.
Yeah.
Because to be fair, she has been through things on her own. But she does not have a true scope for how trapped Heloise is.
And then at the end of the film, all good things must come to an end, or like the small piece of goodness that they had together. The Countess returns, the portrait is finished. There's a really beautiful scene where Marianne does a much more intimate sketch of herself on a page of the book, page 28 of the story of Eurydice and Orpheus for Heloise, because again, speaking to the time and the era, you don't have photographs of people that you can just take. These pictures are all they're going to have. And so she draws that illustration of herself for Heloise to have.
It is also like an explicitly erotic illustration.
Oh, yes, it is. Marianne says goodbye to everybody and leaves. And it's like so emotional because she's walking down the staircase to leave the house and Heloise appears behind her like Eurydice and is like, look back at me, like, say goodbye. And both of them know, like, they're explicitly, like, you, the viewer, are getting that parallel as a piece of, storytelling, but the characters themselves are deeply aware of it themselves, and that's what makes it so in the gut.
And once again, she's in a wedding dress.
And once again, she's actually in the wedding dress.
Yeah.
Like, it's her for real, not just a vision that Marianne is seeing. And the movie kind of just ends, like we mentioned before, all three of them kind of occupying the class that they were set to before. Like they haven't been able to find a relief or a happy conclusion for their situations.
Yeah, we get kind of two postscript scenes because Marianne saw Heloise two more times. The first is Heloise is painted. She doesn't even see her in person. She sees a painting of a, quite frankly, fairly unhappy looking Heloise with a young girl, continuing the cycle of unhappiness. While she's at an art showing where she has a new painting of Orpheus and Eurydice, which is different, as the art critic says, from her father's portrayals. Even though this is painted under her father's name, the art critic has been informed that it's her work. And there's that longing in the painting between the two of them as she's falling.
And the idea, which again is touched on explicitly in the movie by the characters who are kind of analyzing the story as they're reading it, why does Orpheus turn? Does he wish to truly be with Eurydice, or is he taking like the poet's perspective? Yeah. Would he like the memory of her more?
And I mean, that ties into that ending too.
Yeah.
Because that's it's a sad ending, but you can, it's also clear that she can think about this relationship and understand that it was meaningful to her at the time it happened, and it changed her as a person, and she can just be okay with that.
Absolutely.
That the fact that she is no longer with Heloise, and they live very different lives, that she is able to make peace with that because the thing that they had together was so meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think that also kind of mirrors... So, Sciamma has talked in interviews about how part of this movie is kind of her coming to peace with the end of her relationship with Adele Haenel.
Mm-hmm.
And so, obviously, the parallels become very strong when you know that.
The idea that they made this movie after breaking up is kind of wild to me.
Yeah. But it also speaks to their incredible partnership, too.
Oh, absolutely.
That it just transcends romance, and they are just ride or die for each other.
And that lasting affection in this scene where she's seeing the painting in the portrait painted by a different painter. Heloise is holding the book of the story, and it has it open, so we can just see in the painting that it's open to number 28. So it's this idea of a lasting love and affection where society has denied them that. Then the final scene in the movie is the second time she saw her this time in person in Milan at a concert where the orchestra is playing Summer from the Four Seasons by Vivaldi, the piece that was played earlier on the harpsichord. And, it's established earlier that Heloise had never been to an orchestra. Here, Marianne is able to watch her walk into the this box at the orchestra and sit totally alone. And just as the piece starts, you see the emotions of experiencing music break over her, as if she's not only reliving the music, but also reliving events in such a clearly passionate way. And it ends. That's it.
Another, again, really, it really spends time on that one shot of Heloise just experiencing that piece and crying, and it goes on, and I love that it lets you sit in the moment.
And you have no reason to believe that they're able to talk after, because societies does not allow that. And she explicitly says this the last time she said that she saw her. There's no.
And Heloise did not see Marianne.
Yeah,
that's important.
Yeah,
my heart just it gets me so emotional. The because they can't speak, but also what could they say to what is there to say between them?
Right, because that moment is over.
Yeah, all that could be said between them has been said.
Okay, so apparently this is the 1770s. So even if the later scene is in the late 1780s, she has a child who's a couple years, who's elementary aged. Again, the ticking time clock of things are not going to go well for the rich in a couple years. So all of that's going to be upended. They're in a period of intense change where things are going to get better in some ways and things are going to get much worse. It's just a really interesting way to posit this kind of being on the cusp of great reform. I think the most powerful scene every time I've seen this for me is the abortion arc. Because I've never seen a film so bluntly portray the threat of pregnancy and how it is such, in an era before modern medicine, it is such a class uniter.
Yeah.
There's misinformation. They are trying desperately through physical exercise to cause a spontaneous abortion. And then they're relying on herbal remedies and going to what I assume was the local midwife for these herbal remedies. There is an intense risk to that, all while, I love the shot of the midwife's children on the bed with Sophie.
Mm-hmm.
And she's looking at these kids and this parallel of what does this mean? What is the cost of this? I think it's just a really powerful scene and it's also a scene of Eloise stepping up, and Marianne's instinct is to look away as the midwife is performing the abortion. And Eloise says, no, don't look away, making her confront the reality of the circumstances.
Yeah, in this moment, they are all equal. Yeah,
it's dangerous.
Yeah, and there's a real danger. And the pain on Sophie's face, while at the same time, the baby on the bed is holding her hands, because that's just what, little babies do. They grasp onto things. It's so, poignant.
Yeah, that is a command to the viewer as much as it is a line of dialogue that one character is addressing.
Absolutely.
To another character.
And I can't help but draw comparisons to Agnes Varda. Agnes Varda's one sings, the other doesn't, where you have this intense look at the lengths people have to go to avoid the societal consequences and the physical consequences and the lack of choice caused by an unplanned pregnancy. There's also no mention of any kind of father figure or the cause of pregnancy. It's just a reality that happens. We don't know if this was a relationship Sophie's in, which is entirely off screen. We don't know if it was rape. We don't know what happened because it doesn't matter in this moment. Thank you so much, Adriana, for coming on. This has been great.
Thanks for having me.
You can check out, Adriana, what are some of the podcasts you're doing?
I only really do one podcast right now, and it's called Bar Tell Me Something Good. It is part of the Cinema Smorgasbord collection of shows on the Cinepunks network. It is a podcast dedicated to the life and work of filmmaker and actor Paul Bartel, who is also he was also a queer filmmaker. Unfortunately, he passed away many years ago.
So definitely go check that out on the Cinepunks network. And next week, Sarah and I will be diving into more works of Martin Scorsese, though a very different series of works from the kind of gangster films that we saw in Mean Streets. We're going to be looking at Raging Bull, Silence, and Killers of the Flower Moon.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you want to give us a review or a rating on wherever you are listening to our podcast, that would be greatly appreciated. And until next time, I'll see you, Kyle and Adriana. It's been a pleasure.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.